Hello, my name is Sarah, and I am back again with another video on transgender identity and allyship. So today we're going to kind of break down non-binary identity and how it's different and similar from transgender identity. So for many, non-binary is still something new that you might be less familiar with than transgender. It might be an identity phrase that you've only heard recently. You may have also heard similar phrases in the past, like gender nonconforming or gender queer. Sometimes these words are used interchangeable. A lot of past language used gender nonconforming in places where now we use non-binary a lot more commonly. It can be difficult sometimes to catch up when this isn't something you know a whole lot about. As I mentioned prior in an earlier video, some people who are NB, which is kind of short for non-binary, spelled out either the letters NB or ENBY. Some folks who are NB identify as trans and some don't, and I'll kind of get to more of that in a second. But to better understand the ideas of binary versus non-binary and what that really means, I want to first introduce this concept of the gender binary. So the gender binary is this common view that gender exists in a binary system, meaning that there are only two options, kind of like the binaries of like cat versus dog, up versus down, left, right, that kind of idea of man, woman, male, female, boy, or girl. Often, this can be most represented by this idea that with this binary, there are two boxes, and that men are supposed to fit into one box that has all of these masculine traits, and that women are supposed to fit into their box that has all of these feminine traits. And to be a man, you must have all of these traits of being tall, large, dominant, breadwinner, strong, or a leader. Where a woman, you're supposed to fit all these traits of being petite, submissive, a homemaker, being weaker, being a caregiver. The issue with this box idea is that most people do not fit perfectly in male or female categories. A lot of us have traits that can be deemed masculine and feminine and even androgynous to varying degrees. So, an easy example of this might be there are a lot of women that love sports, which is seen as a very masculine thing. And then the inverse, there are a lot of men who really don't love sports, which is kind of assumed that to be masculine, you should have these interests that are very masculine. And it's also important to note that these boxes, though they're pretty consistent in modern cultures, they do look different from country to country. There might be different expectations of what is a man, what is a woman, but the pattern generally consists of you should stay in your box, you should stay in your lane, so to speak. When we're talking about the definition of transgender, obviously this is something I mentioned before, but just to review, the common definition is someone who identifies with a gender that does not correspond to their sex assigned at birth or their gender assigned at birth. I also brought this up before, but with transgender identity, with the transgender umbrella, you can kind of break it down into two smaller umbrellas. One being the binary umbrella. This means people that kind of fit into that man-woman mold. That might be transgender women who are assigned male at birth and later identify as women, or transgender men who are assigned female at birth, women at birth, and really identify as men. So this is pretty clearly following that binary, even though, of course, like not all trans women dress up in dresses and love flowers and all that. Not all trans men are rough in the dirt, watching sports and drinking beer. It still does fit this idea of the gender binary. When we're looking at non-binary identities, this other umbrella in this whole trans umbrella, these are identities that are not strictly man or woman. They can be a combination of genders. Sometimes they may refer to themselves as a third gender or see themselves as not having a gender at all. It can take on a lot of different forms, but the most important thing to note is when it comes to non-binary identity, it's really going against either of these boxes. So some examples of non-binary identities. I know some of these might be new words for you, some of these might not, and this is definitely not a comprehensive list. So I really encourage you to look at look up these terms, look at other terms. There are a lot of great definitions out there, a lot of great glossaries of trans identities that are really great to look into. But to cover a couple examples, one example is gender fluid, which is someone that experiences masculine, feminine, and or androgynous traits in a fluid manner, meaning that their gender expression and identity fluctuates often, maybe day to day, maybe week to week, but it is something where they experience all these different things, but not necessarily I feel man all the time or I feel woman all the time. Another example is agender, which is people who, kind of getting to part of the definition I used before, people that don't identify with any gender. They may see themselves as not having a gender or having their gender expression kind of outside the concept of gender. Another example is genderqueer, which is an identity term used for genders that are outside of kind of the norms, this idea of queering gender or having a queer gender. This can also be an umbrella term in certain contexts to fit other terms, and also some people just identify with genderqueer. Another one that comes up pretty often that I think is helpful to know is bigender. This is identifying with two distinct genders. So maybe it's someone that sees themselves as being both a man and a woman, maybe being both a woman and a third gender. It's really about this combination. I also want to kind of call back to our previous video about different myths, about the fact that there are a lot of cultural examples throughout the world of non-binary identities. I know the last video I mentioned Mahu, and there's a lot of two-spirit identities that fit into this idea of non-binary. Along with those two, there are dozens upon hundreds of third genders found in several different cultures, or genders that have more of a mixture as opposed to I'm a man, I am a woman. So that's also really important to note. And probably most common at this point, a lot of people in this community just identify as non-binary, or non-binary is one of their identity markers alone. So that can really be a fluid term as well. But most people use it to mean that they see themselves as outside of the gender binary, not a man nor a woman. So with this kind of discussion, sometimes it can be seen as non-binary is trans, but trans is not non-binary, which is a little accurate, a little not. As a rule of thumb, it can be helpful to kind of think of it the same way that all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. But like most things relating to people, it really depends. Some folks in the non-binary community don't identify as transgender. It's with this, it can be helpful to kind of take in some context the fact that the term transgender comes from older vernacular that was used in the mid to late 20th century, such as transsexual, that was specifically applied to people that transition medically from one gender to the other. So with the term transgender, there can still be some connotations or implications that one needs to transition from one expression to another. And some non-binary folks don't really see themselves as having transitions, since there is not this clear like man to woman, woman to man, whatever that might be. Many don't even feel a need to transition in the way that binary trans folks do. So some non-binary folks may have minimal to no medical interventions that they utilize. They may not change their name. They may not change their pronouns. There's a lot of different ways that they may or may not interact with transitions compared to binary trans identities. So that being said, it's also helpful to know that a majority of non-binary people do identify as either trans or a member of the trans community. So overall, the biggest rule of thumb with most things related to identity is always ask, don't assume. Another important distinction is that many non-binary folks will utilize pronouns outside of he or she. I know I just mentioned that some do, some may use a combination of pronouns, but it can be really common too to see people using singular they or neopronouns. This can be a heavy grammar discussion, so it's definitely one we're going to table for a later video, but it is something we will get back to. So I hope this has helped start to understand distinctions and similarities in these identities. If you would like to learn more about non-binary identities and just gender expression in general, the different identities there are, a book I often love to recommend is called Gender, Your Guide by Dr. Lee Ayrton. It's a quick read that covers a lot of ground, and it also parallels a lot of the other discussions we'll have. And also, it's written by a non-binary professor who ties in a lot of their own experiences in a way that really helps you connect with what they teach and what they're saying, and really helps put it into perspective. So, as I alluded to a little bit a second ago, next time we're going to dive into the wonderful world of pronouns and kind of understand a little bit more of how to use different pronouns, how to apply different pronouns. So, thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.